It's the week ending Saturday, the 10th of February, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen another horrific mass shooting on American soil, Jacob Zuma standing down as South African president, and the Winter Olympics getting underway in Pyeongchang. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me from the week's digital team are Arion McNicoll and boss man Holden Frith, and from the week junior, Felicity, Capon. Starting the show this week, it's Arion. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
So the US once pledged to bring ISIS to justice, but the question this week was, whose justice?
I think people are a little stunned that these two guys are actually alive. It's not clear what's going to happen next.
And to keep open the detention facilities in Guantanamo Bay.
In his State of the Union address, President Trump had said, he's going to put bad guys in Gitmo, but there are legal difficulties to putting the people in Gitmo, and nobody's ever put somebody from ISIS into Gitmo. I think it's more likely that the Department of Justice, working with the FBI, will try to build a criminal case against these two individuals and bring them back to the United States to face justice.
Adam Goldman of the New York Times discussing the not-so-Fab Four, known as the Beatles of ISIS. So, Arion, two of them remain in US custody at the moment, and the question is, where are they going?
Yeah, and the fact that they were arrested was the part of the story that was probably better covered in the media. But the question of where they're going is the bit that I think has gone slightly underreported, and particularly the diplomatic row that has threatened to emerge between especially the US and the UK over that question. It's particularly between those two countries at the moment because the Beatles became the sort of case in point. But the broader question is also interesting, and the US is trying to address that too.
The broader question being, what do you do with any terrorist if they come back to any country of origin?
Well, I suppose that's the most macro you could go, but in this case particularly, what do you do with ISIS? Now that ISIS is largely defeated in Syria and Iraq, although outposts still hold out. What do you do with those fighters, particularly now that they don't have a state?
For those of you listening internationally who perhaps haven't followed up on this quite so closely, these were four guys from Britain, although they've now been stripped of their British citizenship, who went over to join ISIS in Syria and beheaded, it was dozens of people, and now two of them have been caught. One of them is in prison in Turkey already, one of them's dead, so there's two left. And I'm just curious what you think should be done. If you had the decision, Holden, what would you do?
I confess to having a slightly hypocritical reaction to this. My considered reaction is that the rule of law should always be followed, and due process should be paramount. And I really react against the Defence Secretary, Gavin Williamson's sort of gung-ho reaction of, we should go over and kill these guys, essentially.
To be fair, that was before he was Defence Secretary, he said that, wasn't it?
It was, but he has stood by that.
Difficult statement to climb down from.
Yeah, true. But my reaction is more against his tone than the actions themselves, if I'm honest about it. If these fighters had been killed in combat, I think that would have been the best and simplest solution. The difficulty is because they've been taken into custody, and we then have to deal with them in a more judicial process in cold blood.
Very well. So you've outlined the issue. What's your answer?
Well, the one. So I've been trying to get out of this.
Would you say law should be paramount, but the law of where? Because they were in Syria and they were trying to build a new country. So the law of what? That's
the real difficulty. And I think the reason there's reluctance to bring them to the UK and try them here is because most of their crimes were committed abroad. So they could only be charged with act preparatory to terrorism or something similar. So they would probably have to be released relatively soon. So my solution, which I haven't seen elsewhere, although I may just have missed it, is you could have some sort of international court along the lines of what happened after Lockerbie or the Rwanda genocide. And so it could depoliticise it slightly, but also you could then try them for crimes committed across international borders, and they could be imprisoned in a third country. There wouldn't be that question of, are they just going to come over to Britain and then be back on the streets within 5, 10, 15 years.
But we don't have to hypothesise an international court, do we, Felicity? There is one in The Hague. Why is that not the obvious option?
Well, it's very problematic. Critics say that actually the wheels of justice at the ICC move incredibly slowly at an absolute snail's pace. So justice isn't always done as quickly and efficiently as it should be done. A lot of defendants who have gone on trial have died in the course of justice taking place. I think in its 16-year history, it's only succeeded in convicting 3 defendants. So I think that's quite problematic too. I also think that in some ways, I feel we do, if they were radicalised in this country, they might have had their citizenship stripped. But if they were radicalised in this country, do we not bear some sort of responsibility to see them brought to trial here? However, having said that, I do think there are massive practical issues with that too, in that civilian trials are designed for civilian offences. You would need barristers to amass huge amounts of evidence, which might be very tricky for them. And there's always the looming danger that they are acquitted on a lack of evidence or convicted for minor offences, which I think Holden was alluding to. In
so
which
again,
case
you've outlined issues.
Yeah, well,
I'm asking
I think
you to
it's
suggest what you'd do.
I think it's incredibly problematic. I wouldn't bring them back to the UK because I would be fearful that they wouldn't, the justice would be lacking.
I mean, Donald Trump wanted to put them in Guantanamo Bay. Doesn't look like that's going to happen now. But Arion, do you think that would have been a solution? I mean, that's basically completely prohibiting justice, but it does put them in a place where these issues aren't relevant anymore because it's not really a place.
Yeah, it would have been a solution immediately post 9/11 when America kind of lost its head and was willing to do things like that and just lock people up without any sort of trial. But I think the appetite for sending people to Guantanamo has massively reduced despite what Donald Trump says. Coming back to Felicity's point about the ICC, though, I mean, one of the other reasons that that's difficult to get off the ground is that tribunals have to be established by an order from the Security Council, the UN Security Council. And because there's such a massive disagreement between Russia and the US on what to do in Syria generally, it's just quite unlikely that the ICC will be the place for it. So again, we're sort of stuck. We're snookered whichever way we turn. And yes, sending them back to the UK seems unpalatable, not only because of the reasons that you guys both outlined, but also because I think that there's this feeling that you don't want to give their extremism a platform here. And necessarily that's what's going to happen if you hold a trial.
I do think that the killing of Osama bin Laden was the right thing to do, because putting him on trial would have become such a rallying point for terrorists all over the world. Nothing would have been gained by it, because he certainly would have been executed in the US anyway. And so, although again this makes me slightly uncomfortable, and I'm not a supporter of the death penalty, and I'm not really a great fan of sending execution squads out all over the world, but I do think in that particular circumstance, all alternatives were worse.
Yeah, and I think as to the question of what should be done, there's no really easy answer. But in looking at what may actually be done, there's the possibility that the trials will take place in Iraq. It won't be Syria, because Syria is still pretty unstable, and the Kurds who are holding the prisoners, the majority of ISIS prisoners, don't have control of even the region that they're operating in. So more than likely, I would say many of the prisoners will end up back in Iraq, which is a partner of the US, and they'll face the kinds of trials that we've seen for ISIS members already, which usually involve death penalty and sentences handed out.
What does justice look like for the victims? That's what I'm thinking. I mean, obviously the victims are dead, but I'm talking about their families, for example. The widow of James Foley and people like that. Obviously, I'm not in a position to speak for them, but imagining myself as them, I'd want to see a trial to the standards of a Western court. That isn't going to happen in Iraq.
Well, the victims' families have been very mixed on their reaction to the capture of those last remaining 2 Beatles. So some of the victims' families have said that they want them to be killed, and others have said that they want them to be given a fair trial, as repulsive as their actions were.
But the victims are also the people who have lived under ISIS, and don't they also get a say in Syria and Iraq and how these people should be brought to justice, because they're the ones who've had to put up with the horrors? I mean, I totally agree it's the victim's family too, but I think the victims are broader, and maybe I think it's important that people who have had to deal with these horrendous people taking over their countries and their way of life also should get a say in how they're brought to justice.
That's a really good point, Felicity, but you've just been talking about the bureaucratic nightmare of The Hague. I mean, imagine trying to bring people to justice in an efficient way in the countries that are still being decimated by what happened thanks to Islamic State.
Well, I partly think we need some new radical, revolutionary legal way of dealing with these kind of crimes that involve a kind of a cross-section of countries and legal systems who have been affected to come together. There must be a new system maybe that could be invented.
And in Iraq and Syria, where this fighting has been happening, soldiers on both sides and their families are returning home now. And there's this uneasy acceptance that whatever side you were on then, whatever crimes were committed, they actually need each other to rebuild their towns and their cities. That's just the reality of peace, isn't it? That's what happens after a war.
There's something in that, but when you don't have a state to return POWs to, I don't quite know what the solution is. So, for example, following the Second World War, defeated countries' people went back to their defeated countries. With Islamic State, that isn't the case.
There's nowhere for them to go back to.
There's nowhere for them to go back to.
Highly
and
moderate
in any case,
Egypt and Tunisia and places like that.
Yes, it was an organisation that was claiming territory, and no existing state acknowledged it or wanted them to maintain the territory that they had. So I just don't think that you have that option of allowing the people who were involved in the crimes themselves, or at least the war and the fighting, to be involved in the rebuilding of the states within which they were operating, which was
there's hundreds
Syria
of them.
and Iraq.
I mean, because this is a cause célèbre, isn't it? The so-called Beatles, and we know they. I mean, okay, there hasn't been a trial, but we know they were responsible for killing people because we've seen the videos of it. There are, I think, it's 850 suspected Brits that went to fight for IS. So this now raises the actual practical question. It's been theorised for the last 6 years. It's a real question now. What happens to those other 848?
Yeah, and I think that's the thing that's another thing that many states are attempting to come to terms with. Some, like the sort of Scandinavian countries, are attempting to reintegrate returning IS fighters into society. Others are locking them up. So, and others, like Iraq, are putting them to the death penalty. So there's a range of different solutions. I'm not sure which is best.
I can't imagine many people in this country would be happy with the idea of reintegrate. I mean, the crimes that we're talking about are, off the scale, shocking, awful beheadings. And I can't imagine people would sort of say these people can be rehabilitated.
It would be a serial killer under
society.
any definition, wouldn't it? Even if you take the politics and the war out of it. It's so beyond any traditional understanding of what you do during war that it is effectively a psychopath.
I suppose there are other cases where people may not have been directly responsible for deaths. Perhaps even got there, realised they didn't really want to get involved, laid low for a bit, and then wanted to come back. And those are, in some cases, even more difficult cases because you've, sorting out which ones are the really dangerous people, which ones are the foolish people, working out what to do with people in each category is a real challenge.
Okay, next up this week, it's Holden. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
I've been looking into what might be coming down the tracks.
Across the underground, train stations and track are being modernised. But with London's population growing rapidly, we need to do even more. In the upcoming decade, we will introduce the new tube for London, which will mean faster, more frequent, and more reliable journeys on the Piccadilly, Central, Bakerloo and Waterloo and City lines.
A promotional video there for Transport for London released this week. A bold vision for the future of transport. Holden, what could possibly go wrong?
Well, the problem is, despite the growing population that we just heard about in that video, the number of people using Transport for London services, the tube, buses, some rail services, actually declined last year, we discovered this week.
Curveball.
And
who knew about that? This is why I love this show.
I don't buy it. I'm sorry, I don't believe this can possibly be true. Have you been on the tube?
Beat her with statistics, Holden. Tell us.
It was a very small reduction. It was a 2% fall, so you should have 2% more elbow room on your journey.
Absolutely do not.
But the reason this is significant is that it had been expected to rise.
Yeah.
And likewise across the National Rail network as well, there was an even larger fall in journeys last year, and again they had been expected to rise.
But where are these people going? I mean, as Felicity says, the statistic that London is growing, that is still true, isn't
Yes.
it? Even with Brexit coming and everything, still more people coming into London.
Yep.
So how are they getting here?
There's nobody knows for sure. There's a range of suspected reasons which actually tap into a lot of the sort of underlying trends we've been talking about on this podcast over the past year. So partly more flexible working from home means less commuting. Mm-hmm. More online shopping means fewer shopping trips. People are going out less at weekends and in the evenings, which may be down to some economic uncertainty, or might actually just be down to people preferring to stay in and watch Netflix. And
or
then,
listen to our back catalogue.
of course. And then there's the rise of Uber, which is taking some people off the tube network, particularly late at night.
Now, that is a problem, isn't it? This sounds like a good news story, more space on the tube for everyone, even though it might scupper their expansion plans a bit. But that's a problem because it's not good for our environment, is it, if there are more cars on the road? We all understand that.
That's true, providing that cars continue to be a major source of pollution. But if cars continue going in the trajectory that they're going, which is towards lower emissions and automation, then I wonder whether they could end up being sucked back into the public transport system. So, if not London, other cities across the UK and across the world could end up with big motorised fleets. This isn't necessarily what's happened this week, but we're trying to project forward to what may occur. And I'm not sure that I necessarily see people dropping out of using the tube as an ill in and of itself, especially given that one of the other causes that Holden didn't mention, but I think may be behind what's going on here, is that more people are choosing to cycle around the capital. There are Boris bikes, or whatever they're currently called, but a cycling system that allows you to rent bikes for very little and get around the capital. That seems like a good thing to me. So
and buses too, actually, because I think it was the in the Mashable article they were saying that actually the price of the underground and the price of rail is getting expensive for some people, and more people are hopping on buses, or like you say, Arion, finding other means of getting around the capital. But I think Uber is obviously a growing threat and a competitor and all the rest of it. But I haven't noticed people getting Ubers to and from work. That seems a very luxurious way of getting around town.
And also
I
in
do
London
think it's the
in
flexible
particular,
working thing. I think that's very credible, and I think the rise of delivery and Netflix and having your food ordered and staying in and all that, I can see that too. And then the other reason I think was terror attacks, which I don't buy at all, that people are too scared to go on the underground. I don't think that can possibly be true.
Well, actually, I mean, I know that's the case for my mum and my grandma, both of which basically haven't been on the tube since 7/7.
But were they on it frequently before?
Were they 2% of travellers?
A bit more frequently, but then the point is they're both. My mum will hate me saying this, but it's statistically true. They're both now pensioners. So that isn't your workforce coming into work every day, where even if you are a bit nervous about getting on the tube, you have to knuckle on and get on with it, don't you?
Yeah.
It's also the quickest way to get from A to B in London. I'm sorry to alienate anyone listening around the world who doesn't really care about our transport system, but if you live in the suburbs and you want to get to the centre of town, even if there was a self-driving electric car that cost the same as the train, it would still be quicker to get the tube because it's built in that way. It's the most direct route.
I think one of the reasons this story is significant is that public transport in London and across the UK, perhaps to a lesser extent, has been improving over the last 10, 20 years. And that has been built on the expectation of rising numbers and rising revenue as a result of that. Now that there's less confidence that those numbers and the money will continue to rise, the commitment to investing in future improvements is already beginning to be eroded. So the TfL has already announced that it is shelving plans to add extra trains to the Northern and Jubilee line, which would have increased frequency of service. And because of the way rail procurement works, delaying that decision means it actually probably won't happen in the lifetime of the existing train. So it will be the late 2030s or beyond before that. The decision that was reversed recently can be reconsidered.
But if we assume that it's correct, that basically people are just staying home more, they're staying home to watch Netflix and they're not needing to get into an office so much. If that's correct, then what we need is a transport system that just has fewer trains on it. Fewer people are going to be travelling and they're going to be doing it a bit more infrequently. And if that's the case, then we just have to invest a bit less. I can't necessarily see why it's a problem.
Well, I suppose that's only a problem if you're happy with the current levels of overcrowding, and you hope that you're going to be reducing usage by as much as capacity will fall. I think the feeling is that current planned improvements are actually trying to catch up with existing demands. But I agree that longer term there are much bigger changes underway, and part of the problem is that whether you're talking about National Rail or TfL, they have to plan investment decades in advance, and we don't know whether in 30 years, which is the sort of window we're looking at, there will be automated self-driving pods that can kind of come and grab you from your house and drop you in your office, or whether public transport could actually move much more into that direction. So you could imagine a smart bus system where you logged onto an app, said, I want to get from this address to this address, and an algorithm could work out the most efficient way of getting everyone from within 5 minutes of their location to within 5 minutes of their destination. You could have cut waiting times, make buses much more pleasant to work on, and also cut congestion.
That's a great idea. Who invited Elon Musk in? That's brilliant. Why about smart buses?
We should
You're
go into
absolutely
transportation.
right. Yeah.
Why do we have to wait for 30 decades, though, for that to happen?
30 decades? That's a very long time.
3 decades. 30, 100 decades. Why can't we start... why can't we start doing that now?
Well,
Holden, why can't you implement your transport plans now?
But Uber Pool, the system where you can share a cab essentially with various other people en route, is a step in that direction. It's just that it's still using a car, so you can only have a maximum of 3 people, and
still
it's
relies
a bit
on
clunky.
British people talking to each other.
Yeah,
Isn't Uber on its way out anyway, though?
I mean, this is it, isn't it? We're talking as if Uber are the obvious successors to TfL, but actually TfL are the monopoly who get to decide whether Uber have a right to be on the roads. So they're going to be all right, aren't they?
Yes, TfL hold more of the cards here. But
then they recently decided not to renew Uber's licence, which is obviously an ongoing dispute.
Although I think that dispute will probably be resolved. TfL are really trying to signal to Uber that they know some of the shortcuts they've been taking. They do want Uber to be part of the transport landscape, but they want them to play by the rules.
And I have to ask before we move on, just because this is the show where people casually drop in, oh yeah, when I lived in Hong Kong, or oh yes, I lived in Rome for a while. I'm just curious whether between the three of you have international experience about what London could learn from in terms of transport infrastructure. What do you think is coming down the pipe?
Of the cities I've lived in...
Amazing. Podcast title on itself.
I would say London has been the most advanced of them, but that's because I'm comparing them with North American cities mostly. I suspect if I'd lived in Berlin, then I might have a
I think
different
also when you
perspective.
consider how old London Underground is, it's doing pretty well.
It's Victorian.
It's pretty impressive, yeah. But Santiago in Chile, I lived there for a year. And
amazing.
It's 30p to jump on the metro, and it's pretty darn good, actually.
Yeah, but what's that as a portion of the average wage, though?
Yeah, whatever. Who cares? It's just good.
I lived in Madrid, and they have an underground network. It's very cheap, that's good, but it's terribly unreliable as well. So I'm not sure that we have a lot to learn from them.
Do you know where I lived for 7 years? Letchworth. Felicity, you're next. What do you think is going to be the big story of the week?
Daddy's home, or is he?
When are you becoming a father?
April. We're due on April the 15th.
Okay.
Our first baby.
I'm due at March the 6th, so we're in similar boats,
Brilliant.
my friend.
It's very exciting.
Good luck for the last bit of the
I
journey.
think I'll need it, but thank you.
Yes, I think we'll all need it. But can I ask, are you going to take it up then?
So unfortunately, as a minister, I'm not allowed. Ministers are not allowed to take shared parental leave.
What?
I am, though. I think going to be. It's because I'm an office holder rather than an employee. Ministers aren't allowed to.
That was the BBC's Emma Barnett speaking to Small Business Minister Andrew Griffiths earlier this week. So, Felicity, this is a very odd loophole in the government's new paternity initiative, whereby he can't take advantage of his own new rules.
Yes, it's quite hilarious, really, and slightly detracts from the main issue. But the point with this is that the government is embarking on a new publicity drive called Share the Joy, because so many couples say that they're not aware of their legal rights when it comes to shared parental leave. And it's just a bit of a side thing here that actually it's, ironically, Andrew Griffiths, the minister in charge of this, can't take it because he holds an office, so he's not eligible.
Although, as Emma Barnett pointed out in that interview, he's literally the man that gets to decide the rules, so he could change them if he wanted to include himself.
It's a bit of a nonsense. It's a bit of a nonsense, but it leads into much broader, challenging issues about men and daddies and mummies and who should be at home looking after the baby.
Okay, because, as you pointed out and actually corrected what I said, really, this isn't new rules. This is rules that were implemented, 2-3 years ago, but people were not taking advantage of, so there's a publicity drive.
Yeah.
Why aren't more men taking up their paternity leave right?
I think it's absolutely fascinating. So the shared parental leave was introduced in April 2015, so we have had that now for quite a few years. And it allows parents to share 50 weeks of leave, the first 37 of which are paid, but not very, very much, I would say. So parents can take time off separately, or they can be at home together. So you'd be sharing 25 weeks in that case. And shared parental leave is paid at £140.98 per week, or 90% of your average earnings, whichever is lower. The problem is the take-up of this is your legal right, but the take-up is been tiny. It's as low as 2%, and that's why the government is trying to get more people aware of it. But like you say, it's so interesting. Is it the fact that, dads are just saying, "Oh, I didn't know about that," or is there something else going on? And I would suggest there's something else going on.
Which is what?
Well, I think it's the fact that we still live in I think it's more societal pressures than anything else. I think there are financial penalties, but I think it's probably more societal pressures that a lot of fathers do not feel comfortable going to their employer and saying, you know what, I want to take off 52 weeks and that's my right and I'm going to do that. I think they still see bringing up a child as very much the primary carer, as very much the woman's role. And I also think, interestingly, there might be a lot of women who think that bringing up a baby is sacrosanct and is their domain and don't want a lot of men infringing on that. So I think there's all sorts of things going on.
Well, boss man, you're a line manager. Have people come to you and said, I'm a man, I want parental leave?
I would be fine with that.
Yeah, but has it happened?
It hasn't happened.
And it has happened with quite a few women I know because they were on the show and now they're not because they're on maternity leave.
Will soon be returning. I think there's a mix of financial and social issues going on here. Of my friends, there's only one pair where the father has worked from home while the mother has gone out to work. And so the father has taken a much more active role in bringing up the child. But even then, he was still working and she still took maternity leave. It's just that afterwards he was able to work more flexibly, and so he took a larger role. It also, I would guess, be the case that she earned more than him. So that might have also been a factor in that decision.
Well, I think that must be, for so many families at such a critical time, whoever is the breadwinner, whether it's the woman or the man, presumably they have to really, and it must be incredibly tough actually, if you're the woman and you're earning far less but you love your job and you're passionate about it, and the bloke hates his job but is earning absolutely millions in the city or whatever, you're going to have a very frank discussion where it's like, sorry, you're going off to work and I'm staying with a kid.
Do you know,
and vice versa.
In my own life, I actually have seen friends of mine do this. Two of my best friends have taken shared paternity leave, but thinking about it, in both cases, their female partners were the major breadwinner. One of them was married to a sort of top-ranking lawyer, and the other one was married to a scientist who worked for a university, and both of them had relatively menial jobs.
But it's also practicalities of it. So if you're a woman and you want to breastfeed for the first year, there isn't designated spaces at workplaces that I've worked in. There isn't the apparatus there that you can do that. So actually, for a lot of women, just on sort of biological issues, it's not an attractive scheme,
Arion?
I think that you can address the social considerations, which I agree are massive in this whole issue, by introducing rules that help people reach the right decision. And in fact, Sweden has a clever system which they call the daddy quota, where they allow for both partners in a couple to share parental leave, but a certain amount of leave is only available to the father. So if you want to have more days, or your maximum amount of days as a couple, some of it has to be taken by the man. And I think that is a sort of genius solution that gets around the problems that are inherent in the fact that traditionally bringing up a child has been the woman's job, and that has changed in many parts of the world. But there are ways that you can legislate to make it possible for people to change within their own lives.
There's also at a corporate level, there are things that could change, because most companies pay more than the statutory maternity leave for at least 3 months and often 6 months. But if you were taking the shared parental leave, if you were the father, you probably wouldn't get. Most companies don't pay above and beyond the statutory paternity leave. So there's, even if both parents have equal salaries, assuming that it's above the 140 £6.98 level, there would still be an incentive for the mother to take the leave rather than the father. An odd loophole is that that's not the case if you're adopting. So if you're adopting, you essentially get to choose who the mother is. That's the same for if it's a heterosexual or homosexual couple, and if it's a heterosexual couple, the man can choose to be the mother, it's the primary carer, I think is the term. But that means the primary carer is entitled to maternity leave, regardless of his or her gender. Then the secondary carer, the other half of the couple, is entitled only to the paternity leave.
I wonder if that's because of the biological difference, that there's less likely to be breastfeeding involved in an adopted situation.
I think, that's certainly a rational reason for it. I think it's actually probably just convention and the fact that rules around adoptive leave have been put in place very deliberately quite recently, whereas around maternity leave have kind of evolved over years, and at the time they were instituted, it was just seen as natural that the mother would stay at home and the father would go to work.
It is a benefit, in the true sense of the word. Okay, it's not a lot of money, the statutory pay, fair enough, compared to most salaries. But as you were saying, Arion, if it becomes a contest between the father and the mother as to who gets the allotted amount, it's not just necessarily a case, as you were saying, Felicity, of the woman thinking it's sacrosanct that I'm the mother. She might be thinking, I want as much time off as I can possibly have. And, I'm not saying it's easy being a mum. Of course it isn't. But actually, by 8-9 months in, it probably is easier than going back to work full time. You might as well take the opportunity if you can afford to.
Yeah, I also think, though, that it's really bloody hard work, and I wonder whether a lot of men don't want to do it because they don't want to be stuck at home with a screaming little thing and having to clean up sick and all this. And I wonder whether a lot of men are just not being honest about the fact they'd much rather be at work. But actually, the more you can even it out and it must make relationships stronger. I read a very interesting piece by a guy in the New Statesman who said he had a newfound respect for what his wife actually has to do on a daily basis. And also there's tons of research which shows that kids who spend more time or the same amount of time with their father as their mother grow up to be far better adjusted, intelligent members of society. So there are benefits all around, really.
And that it benefits the fathers too, and the couple, apparently.
Yeah.
That you share out the work, and the couple not only has more time to spend with one another or individually, but apparently they also have more sex.
Oh.
Fun fact.
Good to end on a laugh. That's it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Felicity, Capon, Holden, Frith and Arion McNicoll. For more from The Week, why not visit theweek.co.uk, where you can also sign up to our free email newsletter, The Weekday. Or, of course, you can have the magazine delivered direct to your door. Just head to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. What's that? You want more? Well, just search for The Week Unwrapped on your podcast app of choice and hit subscribe. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.